Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, the first inaugural session in the webinar series of research communication. We're so glad to have you this afternoon and perhaps morning somewhere. My name is Anne Waithaka, Senior Communications Officer with the African Population and Health Research Center, and today I'm delighted to be your moderator. This webinar series is part of initiatives towards enhancing knowledge translation and research communication, and is a partnership between the Free College of Communications and the African Population and Health Research Center. And shortly we'll get to know about these two institutions and why they decided to come together. Today's webinar asks us a very pertinent questions: why researchers must enter or should enter the public space, where they must engage with the public through their research. And from the presentations we'll be engaging with today, I hope we'll be able to answer this question rather. And maybe just to give a rundown of how we've planned this 90-minute session, we'll have 3 presentations from experts in the area, and we'll get to know about specifically what they'll be talking about shortly. We will also engage in a panel discussion and have some time for Q&A to get your comments, questions, and feedback. As we carry out this webinar series and other knowledge translation capacity strengthening initiatives, we would want to hear from you the expectations you'd have, your needs. And so we have a survey that if you've not come across it, we would encourage you to take part in. It takes about 3 to 4 minutes, and this will help us to further shape this initiative moving forward. My colleagues are going to share the link in the chat, and I would encourage you to respond to the survey as we progress, and the link will also be shared towards the end in case you're not able to. With me in the session, our speakers, I have Professor Dickson Chibanda, and we'll get to know more about him and others as we progress. We have Desmond Latham and Alex Manyasi. We'll also get to hear from Mamadou Diallo from the African Population and Health Research Center, as well as Mama Ponya from Free College. And to start us off, I welcome Mamadou Diallo to just give an overview of APHRC. Then we can proceed from there. Welcome, Mamadou.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone. So let me just quickly share a quick slide here. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you again for being with us here. And just quickly to introduce APHRC, we are an African-founded, African-led, and Africa-based organization. We pride ourselves to be really a premier research to policy institution, generating evidence, strengthening the R&D ecosystem, and engaging policy to inform action on both health and global development. At APHRC, the heart of our work is really driven by what we call the EIDM, the evidence-informed decision-making, which we use as an approach to be able to drive change and policy impact across the continent. We have a footprint of in about over 44 countries in Africa. And we really believe that Africa and African-generated evidence must be at the forefront of decision-making. And basically, in our approach, we are organized in 3 different integrated programmatic approach areas. The first one is generating evidence, like I said, our research program, which is the very big or the biggest one. Then we have what we call research and related capacity strengthening, which is really how to support the research and development ecosystem. How do we strengthen beyond the research capacity, other capacities that could be, for instance, funding, fund management, but also different other capacities beyond normal support to academic programs, fellowships, and so on. And then we have the third one, which is policy engagement and communications, which is part of the program that has partnered with Frey College to be able to deliver this series. So let me just quickly talk about the why of this series. What underpins these knowledge translation initiatives and others? The first one is there is a challenge or there is a demand for attention. If you look at the evidence ecosystem today, you will agree with me that there are a lot of platforms, there are a lot of people claiming to have authority, people talking about different things from different angles. So in that case, it's important for researchers to move from just claiming authority to start engaging audiences. So that's the thing. People need attention from real researchers from Africa. Their voice is needed. The second one is the accountability challenge. More and more funders, but also communities and government are asking for impact. They are asking to prove that our work of generating evidence is not just generating new knowledge, it's really making evidence matters. It's really generating knowledge that matters, that is changing lives, that is changing the daily life in Africa, across the continent. The third why is really about agency. We are talking a lot about communities, about participants in research. How can researchers ensure that their research is really also supporting the agency of the community? The communities are not just a source of data, but they are also co-researchers. They are producing research, they are producing knowledge. And then there is the huge the question of accessibility. We know researchers are doing a lot of research, published in academic journals, published in very notorious spaces, and presented in high-level conferences. But there is more and more the need to make that evidence really accessible. And we think one way to do that is that, like we said, evidence travels through stories. So how do we give a human face to those evidence? How do we make those evidences accessible? And the last but not the least challenge we are trying to respond to here, how can we go beyond just building a lot of content, but talking about the whole evidence ecosystem, the whole knowledge translation infrastructure? How do we build that? How do we create an enabling infrastructure that allows evidence translation to be really something that is very structured, but something that is also impactful in terms of having budget, having capacity, having the enabling environment to do it. So basically, this is why we are here. And I'm really glad that we are happy. We are starting this series with Frey College. We're looking forward to hear a lot more from our presenters who today will be able to take us through different aspects of what I've already covered, but in a more deeper way. So welcome again, and over to you, Anne.
Thank you, Mamadou, and for those remarks. Indeed, strengthening knowledge translation and consequent research uptake is important for Africa's development. I would like to now invite Mama Ponya Motsai from Frey College to share a bit about the institution and to also give a few highlights about the partnership from their aspect, from their perspective rather. Welcome, Motsai.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for the opportunity and a warm welcome to everyone who has joined us. Thank you for making the time to join us today on the first in a series of engagements that we will be doing with researchers across the continent. We're delighted to have you. I know that we have people from all over the continent and beyond. I see even in the chat, we have people from Zambia, Somalia, UK, Nigeria, South Africa, Cameroon, a number of Benin, Chad, Cote d'Ivoire. So from wherever you are joining us, we are delighted that you have joined us, and we hope that this is the beginning of a long engagement and in a long relationship that adds value to your work and ultimately to the African continent as a whole. As Anne said, my name is Mama Ponya Motsai, and I am the CEO of Frey College. And Frey College is the other partner in this collaboration along with APHRC. And what we are trying to do here, this collaboration, which aims to a partnership to support Africa's research, communications, and policy influence, is really because we recognize that effective and strategic communication is one of the most under-invested tools. And yet it's extremely central to Africa's development agenda. And when researchers can articulate their evidence in a compelling manner, they don't just inform policy, they shape it. And this is really where we are hoping to support you in over the next few years and the work that we're trying to do. We recognize that African researchers are doing some of the most important work on the continent. Your work has the potential to change the lives of ordinary people, and too often that work stays only in academic journals, and it doesn't go as far as it should go. And this is really where what we're trying to help. And especially because we are living in a moment of enormous noise. Misinformation travels faster than evidence. People who have no grounding in research are the ones shaping public opinion, influencing policy, and filling spaces that researchers are leaving empty. So today, really what we are starting here is an invitation for you as a researcher, as someone who works in civil society, as someone who works in communication, to fill that space that should be filled by people who are generating evidence, to fill that space so that we can see, so that we can begin to see public engagement and policy engagement not as a burden or an afterthought, but as a natural and powerful extension to the work that we are already doing. And this is really our hope. And so together with APHRC, what we're going to be doing, we're going to be hosting this webinars over the next few months. And that's only the first phase. The next phase will include also fellowships where we work with groups of cohorts of researchers and communicators to take them through a program so that over the next few years we can be working to build a community of researchers who have the capacity to take their work through communications to everywhere where it needs to go, to our communities, to our policymakers, so that we can really create a culture of evidence-based decisions on the continent. And the purpose of these webinars is to also get us to start engaging with the difficulties of that work. So even from today, some of the speakers will be sharing about how we overcome some of those difficulties. But really, we wanted to start with a webinar that discusses why we should even be entering that public arena as researchers. Because when we as Frey College, as we do training for researchers, communications training, one of the questions that always arises, why should I be doing this? And so we're hoping that this is the first conversation in many that we'll be having, and it answers many of the difficult questions that you are having as we go along. But really, we want to thank you for joining us today. And we want to really invite you to not make it a once-off thing. And from the speakers, the excellent speakers that we will have today, that you will also be hooked to walk on a journey with us over the next few years, the next few months, where we together really increase our capacity to communicate better for better policy and ultimately for better lives for the African people. So with that, I just want to say thank you for joining us, and we hope that the next 90 minutes will be of value for your time. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Mama Ponya. You've said so many nuggets, but for me, I've picked that research communication and knowledge translation initiative should not be an afterthought. And I hope with the numbers we have today and the representation footprints within the region and beyond, start us off on a journey that will work together to ensure that we build a critical mass of people advancing that. We'll now move to presentations. We have 3 speakers with us today, and each speaker will have about 10 minutes, after which we'll come back together for panel discussions before then opening the floor to questions. As the speakers present, I welcome you to send in your questions through the Q&A feature. I encourage you to use the Q&A feature as we have quite a bit of chats going around, so your question may get lost there. Please utilize the Q&A feature. And I would also like to remind you that we have a survey that will help us to shape our efforts and approach to engaging with you through the webinar series and other initiatives. Our first speaker is Professor Dickson Chibanda. He's the founder of Friendship Bench. And I invite Professor Chibanda to tell us a little bit about himself once he takes the floor.
Hello. God.
Hi.
You're on, Prof.
We can hear you.
You can hear
You
me.
can't hear me.
No.
Yes.
Sorry. So I have 10 minutes. Is it?
Yes.
All right. Now
yes, just a minute.
Sure.
Okay.
Tell me when you.
Yes, just a minute. Prof will open today's discussion by making a case for why researchers cannot afford to remain on the sidelines of public life. And his presentation is interestingly titled, If Not You, Who? So, Prof, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me and giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on this very important subject. As human beings, we connect through stories. And stories essentially define our identities and our culture and the context from which we emerge as human beings. And unfortunately, when you look at research, particularly for Africa, our research often aims to emulate what comes from the global north. Our research often does not reflect the essence of who we are. You know, when you think of concepts like Ubuntu, Ujamaa, Sankofa, and so telling stories through research becomes extremely critical for us as African researchers, because it's through those stories that we reach communities. Unfortunately, our training often focuses on presenting at international conferences, publishing in scientific journals. Through my journey over the last 20 years, almost 20 years, what I've actually learned that some of the most powerful platforms for conveying our research stories are actually not the scientific journals. You have platforms like, opinion editorials, where you share a thought that stimulates communities to start thinking differently about a particular subject. I always say to my PhD students and postdocs who are doing, cutting edge research, I always say to them, if you cannot tell your research story in your native language, then you've lost the plot. And unfortunately, a lot of us are capable of articulating our research in English extremely well. But that excludes the people that we are supposed to actually be doing that research for. And so the stories that we tell ourselves as researchers need to extend beyond the scientific community. I think as you embrace the knowledge systems that are out there around research, it's important to also embrace knowledge systems that are indigenous, African knowledge systems. And the key question, I think, is how do you establish equipoise between knowledge systems from the global north and knowledge systems from the global south to ensure that the stories that we tell about the work we do are truly reflective of the communities that we seek to serve. And this has always been a challenging question that I have faced over the years. And it's really around concepts. I'll give an example of my own work, which is in mental health. In the communities where I work, when you talk about depression, you lose the community. But when you talk about kufungisisa, which is a Shona word, which literally means thinking too much, people connect with you. The other thing as well that I want to share as I conclude, so I can give space for others, is the names that we ascribe to things can make or break those things. There's a story I often share about my work with the Friendship Bench. When I first started doing this work, I called the project the Mental Health Bench. And interestingly, no one in the community wanted to come and sit on a mental health bench. And it was one of the grandmothers, one of the very first grandmothers that I worked with, Grandmother Jack, who after a couple of weeks took me aside and she said, "You know what, doctor, we need to change the name." And they suggested Friendship Bench, which to me didn't make sense at all. But anyway, to cut a long story short, we changed the name to Friendship Bench. And the rest is history, as they say, because everybody wanted to sit on a friendship bench. So I want to end with that by just highlighting how the education system that we have as Africans has inherently taught us to think in a very Western way in terms of how we share knowledge and how we deliver that knowledge to communities. And this is the challenge we need to be asking ourselves. How can I integrate genuine Africanness in the stories that I tell? And how can I take those stories out of the scientific space? Because it's through taking those stories out of the scientific space that we really reach communities. And last but not least, for those of you who are in the medical space, the greatest challenge we face is the over-medicalization of human suffering, because when we over-medicalize human suffering, we take away the community's ability to actually engage, interact, and be a part of the solution. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. To use the cliche, short and sweet, really research achieves its greatest value when it reaches the people it's intended to serve. We'll move on to our next speaker in the term from pre-intermediary. Desmond's presentation is titled Reading the Room, and he will help us understand the media, social, and political landscape that researchers need to navigate to communicate effectively. Welcome, Des, and please take a few minutes to just tell us a little bit about yourself and perhaps something about Free Intermedia.
Thank you so much, Anne, and welcome, and hello to everyone. I've been listening with fascination to research. During COVID, we worked with CAPRISA South Africa, which is the Center for AIDS Program Research in South Africa, and we learned an awful lot about the integration between research and communicating to both thought leaders, the power block, and the average person in the street. And of course, it was about life and death. So I'm very pleased to be able to be part of this, having learned a lot. We think about the combination of media and what it all means in the modern world. I mean, one of the big things, just to go over us quickly, my background is varied in digital and legacy media, starting during the apartheid era as a reporter for Radio 702 in a radio station. I studied computer theory and other things at Stanford University. I've run network news agencies that supply information around the world and in Africa. I've run a Business Day channel in South Africa, which is a television channel doing business reports. I've been a mobile phone app CEO for 10 years, my own company doing applications, content for people to buy. And I've worked even in GCI's government communication information system. I was headhunted during the change of leadership in South Africa to do digital first training. I'm comms expert, and I do a whole bunch of podcasts at the moment, as well as photography and videography around mainly SADC region, but further afield too. Free Intermedia was started in 2005 to change narratives about Africa. We've been going 21 years, and the whole aim here is to work with social justice movements rather than be PR company. So we have some very strict rules about who we engage with and how we operate. So that's the broad overarching background. I mean, the big thing about that I've been looking at with what we're talking about here is the reality of change of mass information. It's really important just to quickly go through this because, I mean, you had the age of authority, which came through from kings and chiefs and churches and empires, colonial administrators and elites. We've kind of gone back to something like that. Between there and now, we've had the mass age of journalism, mainly because of world wars, which threatened everyone's existence. And so the idea of truth as an important thing, a pattern of inaction, the truth separating us from disinformation and misinformation. We went through a period of a few decades of this, and now we're in the age of the network age, which is algorithms and influencers, messaging apps and assistants. And there's very little verification when it happens. Many people, because of their silos of politics, ignore it. Very difficult to verify information. So a lot of researchers we've worked with have said, I don't want to play there, because these people don't know what they're talking about. And of course, nature abhors a vacuum. So if you're not playing there, someone jumps into that vacuum. So I think that looking at African news gathering and information services generally, there's around the world, there's a news avoidance which has occurred because of bad news traveling. So what has happened is, generally speaking, a lot of people in the world are now eschewing standard news, and 42% of respondents globally are saying they're moving away from just watching the news. The social media and video is taking over. YouTube is the second biggest search engine in the world. A lot of people use YouTube to search for their lives. They're using AI now, but they're still using YouTube. So that's had a major change in how people refer to information. The third is the fracturing of referrals. And what that means is that in developing markets, up to half of the respondents to various researchers, and this is just from Reuters and other agencies, say that their search traffic is not really relevant in developed markets, so in America, Europe, and so on. So a lot of people are moving away from Google as a search engine to get their news more directly from social media, whereas in Africa, it's still 42% roughly is using search of some kind, digital information. So you can see there's a thing in Africa that is the same as parts of the world, but also different. And we need to understand that people in Africa generally, thought leaders and so on, are still applying certain rules that in other parts of the world, they're more apt to follow their social media friends. There's still that response in Africa generally towards some news and news gathering. So there's a thought leadership component here that we need to take into account. So I think the big thing to say is that in 1950s, midway through last century, there were a lot of researchers who were saying, how do we reach the public? Do we even care if they understand? And now a lot of people are saying, can you actually understand the public? Can you understand the difference between trustworthy and non-trustworthy information? And that's led a lot of people to become very cynical about the flow of this news. So we don't really have an information gap, as Anne has mentioned, and the professor earlier. We have a verification chasm. So there's this thing about who do we believe in how. So, Anne, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Please, your presentation, it's not.
Oh, is it not?
Yeah.
Okay, so can you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
Apologies. So you must be thinking I'm mad. So talk about an information gap. There was an example. So during the pandemic, as an example of this disinformation process, is there's peer-reviewed evidence that people were looking at in Africa specifically, and thought leaders there as governments who were working on that, as well as the guidance they were getting from specialists. A lot of other people going straight to YouTube and social media. They were sharing WhatsApp, which was a huge zone of not just misinformation, a difference between mis and dis. Misinformation is mistakenly, disinformation is actively. So people were actively, knowingly sharing incorrect information about vaccines, for example, and the effect it was having on people with autism, etc. Their celebrity opinions. Now, celebrity are very powerful on influencer zones digitally. Whatever they say goes. Often people would follow what they say. And because of a lack of information and knowledge, they would progress really bad opinions. And then, of course, your friends. Viral marketing works when your friends tell you something, you tend to believe it or go to it. So when research crosses into life and death situations, the decision is information dependent. So right now, many of us use AI to decide when to take flights or whether or not we can trust vaccines, to where should we invest our money or pensions, where can you get water, those that have access to data and so on. And then working in government, I realized for a year as the chief director of information on products and platforms is that it's a myth to say Africans don't access data, information-based services. What we discovered in Africa was that a lot of youths access information digitally and then they share it with people who are not digital. So they would then get information and share it. So we had a grant program in South Africa with the SASSA system. We moved everyone from cash to card systems. About 2 million, mainly women in rural areas, were not moving into the card system. And the way we focused comms is to focus on the children of those people, to say you've got to go and get a bank account so you can get your money digitally. And we, in a year, that was a success quotient where we managed to get the youths who were getting data to pass it on. So you can see the viral power has changed in the last 5 years. So in the past, traditional media has sit back, newspaper, radio, TV, whereas now digital media is websites, social media, podcasting, messaging apps, AI. Information flows in numerous directions. Anyone can be a publisher. Audiences discover information first. And this is where, for researchers, I think it's fundamentally important. There's this gap between reality and what someone else is saying. And if you're not jumping into that gap, that someone else is stealing your lunch, basically, and also is a threat to knowledge management in terms of Africa and beyond. So researchers, we all communicate in kind of ecosystems. It's not a newsroom. So we can share information, but then that information needs to get to an audience. So the balance, the scale, the evidence versus emotion and novelty. So the big thing here is, as Professor was saying a minute ago, human stories. The thing that we're finding is that you've got to address the issue of language and also the way in which we speak about messages, speak about conflicts and clashes, speak about medicine. It's just little words that change people's perceptions, and of course linked to that is visuals. 80% of information shared at the moment digitally is visual. Someone shares a picture or a video. It's really a potent messaging technique. So you can get around this information overload by focusing on your audience and a way in which you can spread your news quickly. I've had people say to me that I'm a researcher, I don't do digital, I don't know how to do an ad. And I worked with Stats SA, Stats South Africa, which is the state medium that does the census, for example. And the person who ran the comms there was not being given a budget to do basic design. So what she did is use PowerPoint to design social media images, which had millions of shares, very simply using black and white, the PowerPoint logos to explain census-based information. So to say, oh, I'm not trained in this, I can't do it, is a bit of a get out of jail clause, I think, for people whose core reason to live life is to research things. The responsibility now is on us to make sure, because we know this now, that we cannot turn our backs on the flow of media because it's not traditional. And yet we have to go after the thought leaders of the world, which is traditional media. So one of the I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to share the presentation. Even if you don't want it, I believe you're going to get it. So the big thing here is to say that we all communicate. Everyone on this call is an executive, a professional. There are highly skilled doctors and researchers here. You've got to your position because you can communicate. So to say to someone, well, it's not my job, is deflecting the reality, which is to say that they don't know, I need to tell them. So that's the important message, I think, from the change in why we need to be in the room as communicators. It's really altered radically in the last decade. In the last 5 years, it's shifted gear. So that's overarching comment I just wanted to make. I know my 10 minutes up. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Oh, insightful nuggets. I think I'm loving every conversation in this webinar, and I hope our participants are too. Thank you for utilizing the chat feature, and I encourage our speakers and presenters to please address the questions as we progress, and please keep your questions, comments coming. We will have our final presentation from Alex Manyasi, who's a Policy Engagement Manager at APHRC. And Alex will take us through from evidence to influence, and we will explore how researchers can begin translating their evidence into meaningful policy engagement. Alex, nice to see you. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you love my background. Allow me not to present, but speak to my slides. As the previous presenters were speaking, I decided to do this differently so that then we are aligned. When we talk about evidence, it also connects to aspects of data and how much that is utilized by the continent. And as we speak to that, we, for example, know that Africa only accounts for less than 3% of the global research output. And as we let that sink in, probably the worst part of it is not even the 3% part, but the aspect of understanding that a very small percentage of that small percentage is actually used for decision making. So you can imagine your contribution is very low, but at the same time, the very little that you do is not even used in decision making anyway. So the very many months and years of quality work that our research has put in is then in the process lost, because then there's not much that is captured from what our researchers do in terms of decision making. Having said that, so what some of the basic questions having been in the policy space for a while, for quite some time, and supporting different governments make decisions that would then influence how the policies and laws are made. One of the critical questions that I keep asking myself every time is, how are our leaders making decisions? So one of the answers that I do not expect to get is that they will go through peer-reviewed journals. That doesn't happen. So the environment in which our leaders operate in is high stakes, fast-moving environments. So sometimes the primary driver is immediate crisis. Sometimes it's institutional survival. Sometimes it's budget limits. Sometimes it's just political optics. And so if you think about that way, then if a leader is elected for 5 years, for example, and they are in their first year of office, probably the decisions they'll make at that point will be very different from if they're in their last year of office. And therefore, if a piece of research does not immediately help a policymaker solve a pressing political or structural problem, then by all means, it just ceases to exist to them. It doesn't matter how beautiful it is. It doesn't matter how accurate it is. It just does not exist. The most intriguing part, or the most disappointing part, is that our researchers still look at it historically by operating under the assumption that evidence will eventually speak for itself. It does not. Out of the evidence that we have, it actually does not. So if we want our work then to change things in the real world, then we must start shifting our thought process. We must start by stopping acting as data generators and start getting to be interested in active policy navigation processes. How do we then translate our findings into practical, actionable machinery that fits seamlessly into the realities of governments, just from the reasons that I've given? And therefore, as we think about that, it's important to look at some of the work that we have done and how we have utilized that using evidence, but without having the assumption that everybody will by all means understand that the figures speak for themselves. So in terms of the definition of policy influence, I like looking at it from one part being instrumental, which is immediate action, which will most of the time speak to rewriting of laws, changing of fiscal regulations, reshaping of institutional guidelines, which we usually do most of the times when we get funding, for example, to support a certain process. That's what we focus on. But there's also the conceptual shift, which is more of the mindset, which would most of the time look at how do we overhaul long-term political mindsets? How do we introduce new frameworks into public debate? So those are things that are long-term, which even as we speak about our contribution, the contribution of research, we do not even think about that much, because long-term things are even less interesting to policy makers and political players who most of the time are the ones responsible for making those shifts. Now, I like speaking about the National Sanitation Management Policy, which was first of its kind in Africa. And I say first of its kind because we used to have data, we used to have benchmarks, we looked around across the continent, and we were thinking about how do we ensure that we have a policy that speaks to where Africa should be going. And we used Kenya as a benchmark. So in terms of the pivot, how we look at how do we transition a highly fragmented and a sector of least interest using local data landscapes into an aligned, unified national policy framework. And with that, one of the actions that we took was to ensure that we have active co-creation of key guidelines along with the ministry technical experts, And just to mention that sometimes we imagine that the technical people within ministries and governments don't understand. Most of the times we're actually wrong. And most governments, especially if you look at the Kenyan context, they pick fairly competent people. They get students from universities and not anywhere else. And therefore, when these people are taking place in government, the assumption that they don't understand is not true. And therefore, our action was, in terms of the co-creation process, ensuring that we have government officers, especially the technocrats, the partners, citizen representatives. And instead of just publishing papers, we sat together and said, this is how Africa is looking at, like, this is how this sector is looking like. And if we don't do something, this is how it will look like in the future. And that's how it's going to impact our economies going forward. Those conversations with the political buy-in, in this case being the ministers' levels and the principal secretaries' levels, ensured that we had buy-in from the word go in terms of the understanding and the collective understanding of between government and non-government players. That's something needed to be done. So we were not talking about just saying that we have published and therefore you can read. We were saying that this is where we stand as a country, what we need to do. How do we support you? How do we ensure that you take leadership in the process of ensuring that the country actually moves forward? So one thing that I want to mention before I stop talking is that policy influence is not a straight line most of the time. So it will require addressing both immediate and structural rules, and it will require very gradual narrative shifts. And I am saying that because I know that my team did not just stop at generating data on the state of sanitation in the country, but the breakthrough occurred when stakeholders, including researchers, technocrats, and everybody else that was required, found themselves seated at the table and said what we need to do to fix the issue and to fix the problem. Remember, we were talking about a sector that is not of interest, a sector that was fragmented and lying almost every ministry that you can think about. But for us to collectively then say, this is what we need to do, we had to devise a method of ensuring that all of us find ourselves at the same table to look at what is it that we can do, even before you use evidence and data to then develop the policies that to do that. Allow me to stop there, speak to more in the coming minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. I think being your colleague, and I've heard you speaking about policies in the, you told me the other day, sanitation and water, and maybe you can mention why we now say sanitation and water and not the other way around. It's interesting because most of us don't think about this among the priorities we believe are developmental needs, and that case study is quite interesting and insightful. Thank you, and thank you to Dixon and Des for those insightful presentations. Participants, we've heard why researchers need to engage publicly, the audiences they are speaking to, and how research can begin to influence policy and practice. And before we explore these ideas further through a panel discussion, I just want to remind you that we have a short survey, research communication and advocacy needs assessment, that we would appreciate if you could respond to, so that we are better informed to engage and refine our efforts. If today's presentations have sparked ideas about the communication skills or support you need, please take a few moments to complete the survey. Okay. We can move to the panel discussion, and in the interest of time, I know Dixon will be dropping off because he has another important meeting to attend to, and perhaps I can begin with him for us to just sort of understand. We know it is important, but why do many researchers resist public engagement? We've mentioned this, but why do you think they resist public engagement even when they know it matters? Dixon, over to you.
I think it's partly because of the training that we get. And most training that researchers get, academics, often does not include public speaking. It often does not include skills that you require to write an opinion editorial, skills that you need to stand in front of a non-scientific audience and give, say, a TED talk. So part of it is the capacity that we are building around our researchers. The second reason is because we don't engage with communities at grassroots level, like the community gatekeepers who actually know the context and the stories, the people who are proximal to the problem, who are able to actually teach us how to tell the stories. Like I said earlier on, a good research project is one which can be articulated in the local language, and the lowest level person in the community can grasp it. You know, oftentimes the research we do is Greek to our communities. Only scientists understand that. So I think we need to be mindful about how we tell our stories, learning how to tell our stories as we start to write our research projects. Again, I'm always saying to my PhD students, give me an elevator pitch in the local language about the research that you're doing. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dixon. You've highlighted why researchers hesitate to step into the public arena. But once they do, then I guess the next question becomes, who are they actually trying to reach? Just from your perspective, who are the most important audiences for research in the African context, and why?
This is one of the most challenging questions someone's asked me the last few weeks. And because everything's really different throughout the continent based on where you are, language and needs, and also government involvement. But I think you have to say that as researchers, and what we saw working with the COVID process quite deeply with elements, and also stretching back 15 years or more on this question, you've got to get the policymakers and governments involved. You have to target them, get them to understand what it is that is so important. And I know I'm speaking to the converted here, so I won't spend much more. Why? It's because when they make a decision and have the money, the millions of dollars to spend on some of these things, it kind of short circuits some of the other reach that you're trying to achieve. But I understand that that's a challenge. So I just wanted to put it there. The second is local community. So it's like the direct opposite. So the policymakers and governments, the next, Professor Chipanda has put his finger on that problem. I love that note about making someone explain their PhD in the local language, in one sentence or two, elevator pitch. Brilliant. Because that's how you reach local communities. And that's why my note about how we dealt with the grants program and millions of women, mainly poor in the rural areas, we're going to not get reached, is because we then focused our comms on local communities through the children to get them to tell their parents. So that addresses local and national instantaneously. If you can manage that combination, you really are on a good thing. The third is academics. And the problem with academics is that people dispute findings forever. And there's always a lot of ego involved. So forgive me for saying that bluntly on this show, on this webinar, but there is a lot of tension between academics and researchers. But you have to be able to reach your allies through not just a presentation at an international event, but also through the logic of what you're saying. So sharing that research, which is a very different philosophy to the Western culture, I guess, about how people share knowledge at times. So trying to attract attention on your comms, and the reason why is to get them on your side, I suppose. The NGOs who are always on your side based on the sector and the silo of information that you're gathering. So that is kind of like an obvious one, but you need to get them involved, because they, even today, with all the difficulties we're experiencing with NGOs in Africa and the geopolitical position, you still need them there. The fifth is business. when you communicate your ideas directly to social media, to blogs, to everything else, podcasts, it becomes locatable, and businesses are always in that place. And once they recognize your consistent message, they come on board. And that's the secret, is consistency. Then moving into international organizations, the ones that are really biased in your favor based on your specific research. So I think that's the 6 main ones. The big thing I think that we've seen is proven transculturally, transnationally, is the policymakers and governments, the local communities. If you get those two to respond, the local community then puts pressure on its local polity, its local leadership, and then they force change into government from below, and then simultaneously working at the high level and the cocktail parties and the networking and everything else you're doing with government and policymakers through your communication. And it's a 2-phase kind of success. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Des. Decision makers rank up there in terms of the audiences that we must engage if we want to move research to action, to policy, or to practice. And perhaps, Alex, you can tell us a little bit about, we have very good research, yet it might fail to influence policy, even when the policy makers are aware of it. Why do you think this happens?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. And one of the reasons that I spoke to, which is the timing. For example, you get to speak to research at the time when government is making decisions about something that is very different. When you get to publish your research, you're publishing your research at the time when there's an election, for example. And therefore, at that point in time, maybe the pressing need is put. But for you, you're talking about something as different as why we need to invest more in irrigation, for example. But the pressing need at that point, people are not listening to irrigation, which will take a while to invest in, but they're talking about how do we ensure that people get food today. Like in the Kenyan context, for example, right now, I am sure if you walked into government today with evidence around how to ensure that you provide food because the rains have failed in most parts of Kenya, the possibility is you might be listened to. But if you walk there with a different narrative or a different set of evidence to talk to government about something that is not related to what is going on today, the possibility is that they will not even listen. But secondly, it's the channels sometimes we use. For example, the formal channels, we know them. You submit written evidence, either directly or indirectly, you publish, you present your testimonials through the official task forces. You share the same with the official legislation calendars and response windows. But there are other channels that we rarely think about, and this is the informal channels. Do we take our time to conduct private low stakeholder briefings, for example, with key technical advisors? Do we take, for example, some time to share early pre-publication insights? For example, you don't just show up one day and say, this is the research that we've been doing for the last 3 years, who cares? And as we engage in terms of the interactive workplace dialogues to even map systemic data demands, do we take some time to think about the systemic data demands? And for example, if you live in Africa, it's very easy to know what are the systemic data demands that different governments will demand for. Do we even take that time to think about that? Most of the time we don't. And so because we don't do that, for me, I get surprised that we get surprised that our data is not utilized. Because the way we present the data, the way we think about it, and like I said initially, we think that our data will speak for itself. It does not. So the more we think differently about how we ensure that our research is utilized, the more the possibility that we will actually get to a point where our data will be utilized by the people who matter most. And these are governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Prof. Chipbanda, are you still with us? I know you're about to drop off, but perhaps you can.
I'm still here. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. I would propose perhaps you respond to a question or two, so that when you drop off, at least the audience can get some more nuggets from you. And one of the questions
Sure.
is, very few African countries have adopted one of the major languages as national language, for instance, in Nigeria. Deborah, could you please read the question for me?
Okay. Very few African countries have adopted one of their major languages as national language. For instance, in Nigeria, we don't have a national language of communication, which hinders communicating research stories in a native language. What do you advise? This is from Gigado in Nigeria.
That's a great question. My response is, in every community in Africa, we have our own local native indigenous languages. They might not be officially recognized, but we still use those languages. So essentially, it's using the language from your community and your people to articulate the research that you're doing. It doesn't have to be official. It doesn't have to be an official language. I mean, I was recently doing some work in Mozambique, where they have lots of languages, and again, we encouraged people to just use the local language to articulate the research that they're doing. If you speak briefly in your local language before you get into English, for instance, the dynamics change automatically when you are presenting about your work. So just to remember that. Thank you.
Okay, another question to you is, I see oversimplification as a real risk in storytelling. How can we maintain the facts and authenticity of scientific data, but still share the information in a way that resonates with people? How do we strike the balance? That's from Faith Onea in Kenya.
We strike a balance by going to the people who are proximal to the problem. And I will share an example from my own work. When you go to communities in Zimbabwe and ask them how they understand symptoms of depression, they begin to use a phrase which commonly is repeated, and that is kufungisisa. Yes, it's a very simple term, because kufungisisa literally means thinking too much, but it captures the symptoms of depression, and so simplification is key. We should not get bogged down into thinking that because we are researchers, we need to use complex language to navigate these spaces. I strongly believe that it's possible to navigate scientific spaces using extremely simple language. Thank you.
One more is how to communicate stories. How to communicate with the stories, the uncertainty in the evidence. The researchers like to state certainties because that is what gets research published, but the community needs to understand the confidence or uncertainties in the evidence.
By trying as much as possible to be authentic. And if you are authentic, there will always be elements of your story that are uncertain. I always talk about the friendship bench, and I will say, yes, we've reached over 1 million people, but we are still struggling with really understanding fidelity and using fidelity as we train more and more people. So it's really about striking a balance, telling the story, the success of the story, but also being honest enough to talk about the challenges that you are facing.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Are you about to drop off, or do you have...
I am still here because I haven't been called, but if I do drop off, I will just send a little message and say I'm dropping off.
Oh, fantastic. We will now move to why researchers should engage from why researchers should engage to how they can actually communicate effectively. And perhaps you can be the first one to take us through how you personally navigate tension between rigor and accessibility when communicating your work.
So I want to start off with just the method that I've used over the years. First and foremost, the community gatekeepers have to be involved right from the beginning, not in a tokenistic way, but genuinely. And how do you ensure that they are involved genuinely? So most of the work I do, we lean into what we call the theory of change. And the theory of change enables everyone who is involved at community level, from the grandmothers that work with, to truly understand what we are trying to do. And my rule of thumb is, if a grandmother from my community cannot understand the hypothesized pathway of how we are getting from A to Z in this project, then we are not ready to start. So that is just the rule of thumb that we use at Friendship Bench and in a lot of the work that I do. When you do that, you remove a lot of assumptions and barriers that you will possibly face as you move forward. In addition to that, the policymakers, make sure the policymakers are involved. Make sure the policymakers have a copy of that theory of change map. Every time you visit them in their office, you pull out the map and say, do you remember, Mr. So-and-so, we talked about this map. Everyone is on the same page instantly. So it's really establishing the foundation, the building blocks for the next phases of what's going to happen. Because when you have a theory of change map, for instance, and members or people in government change, you are still able to go back to that map because the community owns it. It's something that is owned by the community. So critical is involving people who are particularly proximal to the problem right from the beginning. Thank you.
It's a real challenge, and I think in the chats between the participants, I've seen discussions of simplification, with trying to get the public to actually understand you. How do you strike a balance? Someone suggested training, etc. And maybe, Desmond, you can help us understand a little better how we can get evidence effectively to audiences whose priorities are shaped by different factors, from poverty to distrust of institutions or limited access to information. How can we still engage with this group of people and communicate effectively?
Yeah, one of the big problems we have is data costs. So for people, we're talking here about passing on information in visual format. I think the second big thing is patronizing. So there's a tendency for power blocks to patronize people they think are not equals. And I always say to people I'm training on these things, you're speaking to your mother and you think your mother's an idiot. I don't think you think your mother's an idiot, but she needs to understand exactly what it is you say. So drop the jargon and think about how you're going to address this. Luckily for us these days, we have tools called AI, which can help you rewrite quite difficult things into some easier to understand sentences. So when it comes to poverty and precarity, I've always pushed back from government level where I work there to even corporates that I continue to work with. Whenever someone says to me, these people won't understand something, I get very upset because it's the opposite of what the reality is. When you're poor, you're in a position to really understand finitely. So you got to focus your message on the immediacy of me, what it means for you. You can't start off with these big numbers about 2 million people will die in 10 years. You've got to look at precisely what it means for the people you're addressing in a non-dramatic or theatrical way, but you've got to address that clearly. And it's household level value. The traditional approach has been to focus on long-term benefits, but the average person doesn't think in that way. They think next week. So that's the one thing. The second is institutional distrust. Many people distrust institutions, particularly governments and bureaucracies. You can't use that thing of saying, well, they're an expert scientist, so you should do it. It's the opposite. You have to show that through what you are doing, you are dealing with it. So you, as researchers and as people trying to manage change, Prof. Chabanda, you've got to be it yourself. You've got to show through peer messaging, one-to-one. It's validation by being. And a lot of people don't feel it. in terms of the research game that we're discussing here. They preach down to individuals. So we must feel it as the people do. And the last thing is, when you share information, as I explained with the Census South Africa example, they use black and white images, which are tiny. They're kilobytes size. They're not megabytes. So everyone starts sharing them on WhatsApp. Next minute, there's a single image with an example about how education has shaped the country. And it's going to millions of people because they can share it because it's 20 KB. It's not a megabyte. So when it comes to data costs, I do podcasting. I've got between 3 and 4 million listeners to my podcast. And when I make the mistake of sharing a podcast in stereo instead of mono, people tell me, they say, your podcast is 30 megs. It used to be 15. So, and these are people middle class that you would imagine would be in a position. So all of those things, it's understanding that the messaging that we exchanging with people is a technicality, but it's something you can get past as highly proficient doctors and researchers by using some of the tools to enable this ease of discussion. Of course, you can turn it into vernacular as well, which is what we've done over the years in different projects we worked on.
Thank you, Des. Communicating research that is effectively is one thing, but influencing decisions requires another set of skills, I believe. And that's why Alex is an engagement manager. We have communication managers, etc. Alex, researchers we find are often cautious about crossing into advocacy, which sometimes people use interchangeably with lobbying, and I know there is a difference. So where is the line between informing policy and lobbying for a particular outcome? And maybe start off with what is the difference?
Yeah, that's interesting. Most of the times I will use the understanding of most funders. They look at lobbying as, for example, if you engage Parliament, for example, then they would call that lobbying because then you want to change a particular legislation for a specific interest. So that's what most of the entities would look at lobbying as. But advocacy, in most cases, is looking at what is it that the country requires? What is priority on government's plate? How can we help? That is more of policy influence or advocacy. But having said that, I think what the difference between that is probably not the major issue. It's more about because that will be dependent on if the person giving you money is saying that you cannot use my money to lobby, then that becomes a different conversation. However, most of the time, influencing policy is more systemic than coming up and saying we have this agenda that we need to change. So that becomes your agenda, but it does not become the agenda of the country. And to be honest, what Africa's biggest problem today is that most of the money for research comes from elsewhere, and therefore that elsewhere might easily determine the agenda of what then needs to be prioritized. And that sometimes in itself is a conflict between what we want to do in terms of research versus what the countries require as agencies in terms of what is it that is the urgent need for them to address today. And therefore striking that balance is critical in the sense that how do we ensure that what we want to change is something that is aligned to what the country wants, is something that is aligned to what is priority for those countries, and then balance that with who are the people that are funding that initiative. And is it that they have an agenda, or can we integrate the agenda they have to the national agenda? I think once we have those conversations, and I'm saying that because I have done that many times, we have, for example, received money for many different things, but we have ended up down the road aligning with what those countries that we're supporting are more interested in and what the agenda for Africa is more aligned to. And therefore, that has ended up probably, that's part of the reason why we have been very consistent about the work that we've done. We have been able to do things that in a few years many institutions have not been able to do, just because we have ensured that the funding that we have is aligned to what Africa wants and what the different countries want.
Thank you, Alex. James Mengi, I believe that answers the question you raised in the chat. But if you feel there's still a bit more you don't want to hear on the subject, please feel free to follow up in the Q&A feature. And maybe Alex, to follow up, so must researchers become advocates? Must they be advocacy experts? And should they want to?
That's an interesting question. For me, my straight answer would be yes and no. And I say that because there are those who will honestly, even if I became a researcher today, for example, because I'm not, I am a policy expert. Even if I become a researcher today, I do not think that that is something that I will enjoy doing. Probably on the other side, researchers, and I know I interact with them every day. There are some you can tell they have an interest. There are some you can tell they actually don't care. So for those who don't care, maybe it's about time they work with those who care, those who can translate the work that they do into meaningful information that can be shared and that can influence change. For those who care and they want to balance between the two, then probably it's about time they also try to understand. And I would like to probably use that opportunity to maybe give a step or two about what they, for those who want to, can get into. For example, the first step will be just get to understand what are the current bills, what are the top, for example, 5 ministerial technocrats that I will require if I have to make this work progress. Can I be able to track policy focal agencies in my networks, for example, as a first step, just trying to understand the environment. And the part of no that I said is because most researchers will find this too complicated and something that they don't even want to be part of. However, for those who are interested, step 2 will be then, can you, for example, then draft something that is crisp, something that is jargon-free, that's something that is a 2-pager from your 100 pages, and then out of that secure low-pressure briefing, for example, over coffee, or over someone's lunch hour, over lunch. And then are you, for example, able to just listen actively? Sometimes we go to policymakers and we have gone to them, but we then end up being the ones talking other than listening, and therefore by extension, getting information that is helpful in terms of how you want to proceed in the future. And then the third step will be, how do you then ensure that you embed yourself into the inside ministry level technical teams? If they have a working group, are you able to join? If you're doing research, are you able to do co-design for the sake of the future, the research questions that you want to use? And with that, you can then be able to build a track record in terms of your engagement with policymakers. So for those who are interested, then these are things that you might want to do, which might be very helpful. For those who are not interested, in the FHRC example, for scenario, for example, we have teams that are there to make sure that they either handhold you or ensure that they take what you have come up with to then make sure that they run with it in terms of ensuring that they use their expertise to influence the policy space. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. We are almost transitioning to Q&A, and perhaps because of time, I can just get a bit of insights from Des about the media, because often in terms of research, they might not get it correct, they might oversimplify it. And we are still, if you think about mass reach, the media then becomes quite effective, and also mainstream media, we believe, has some public trust. So what does it look like when the media gets research wrong, and what can researchers do? And this question will close our panel discussion, but participants will still have a chance to engage in the Q&A session. Desmond, over to you.
Just very quickly, this is a major question. I mean, we're looking at Ebola in the DRC right now, and the effect of this question is going on right now. So it's a very lively question. It comes about what is the media house or the publisher, what is their attitude towards the truth? When you know they're a lost cause, sometimes I say to researchers, go after the folks who are easier to convince, because that's a campaign. You have to conduct a campaign against disinformation people, those that are determined to lie about science and truth. That's not an easy win. So you can't immediately confront them and say, you ran the story, it's wrong, because they're going to take an oppositional attitude to you and see you as an enemy. So that's a campaign group, which you work on constantly by just inviting them over, talk to them, getting them in, popping up, being part of their panels, and slowly move their thinking into a place that's more accurate when it comes to science and research. But the thing is, you've got to control the framing of the information first. So if you, as I said at the start, if you're allowing the dusty back rooms of research to be your place and home, and it's anathema to go front, because going front is an egotistical action by a researcher. You're just honoring your profession by overselling yourself, aren't you, in a way? What happens in that situation is people who know less become your boss indirectly through the information flow. So controlling the framing is important. And there you as a researcher can pick the kind of things you do. And that means a blog, which is weekly. You're talking about stuff you can talk about. So over time, this takes 6 months or more to grow the search engine response to you. You become the expert in what you are actually an expert at. So you shift that thinking over time. So what I'm saying is no quick wins here. The one win I wanted to stress, and we've seen this over and over, and we don't have enough time for me to convince everyone on this call, but you've got to be public facing. Because you are already. You face the board, you face the donor, you face your mother and father, as professionals with public facing, there's one step from there to being able to reverse the risk of someone saying the breakthrough in cancer research, which is kind of banned in proper media circles. You're not allowed to use that phrase, breakthrough, because it implies someone is going to make some money off PR, and is very seldom as a true breakthrough. So when you hear that, you've got to then engage the reporter directly, or someone who you know can do it. And the last thing is post-publication, is you then set up a debate mechanism where you get people into a room, and then maybe you can run a webinar of some sort where you can talk to the 2 or 3 sides in a way that says, I beg to differ, but we can agree to disagree. And then the reasonable person test kicks in. When someone is dying because they're not getting the vaccine for months, or having significant health effects, over time they'll realize that they're getting mumps because they're not getting a vaccine. So it's not an easy win here. So you can't just phone up a journalist and say you're wrong, because they're going to take a view. And secondly, there are groups of journalists linked to political positions that are overtly ignoring the truth when it comes to science. So that's my sort of quick answer, is to say you've got to get in now, launch your series, your blog, your TikTok series, whatever it is, on the topic that you're brilliantly genius at and are essentially the expert. And so then the search engine finds you. When people Google or go on AI finds your stuff, and next minute pops you up, and the panelist and the panel hires you to talk about something you really know about. So that's my answer, is you've got to engage the media, but some we've found that you just write them off and focus on the easy wins. You can't fight all the battles. Pick your battles.
Thank you, Desmond. We have quite a bit of questions in the chat, and I'll pick on one from the chat. I also invite participants to raise your hand. I can unmute you so that perhaps you can air out your comment or question. And I'm biased towards this question because I love storytelling. And either our speakers, Alex or Desmond, Dixon has dropped off. Mamadou, Mama Panya, or my colleague Deborah can respond to this question. What role does storytelling and lived experience play in communicating scientific evidence to decision makers? And tied to that, how can researchers remain evidence-driven while still communicating enough urgency to influence public policy and behavior? I don't know. Can I direct that to Mamadou?
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Anne. That's a very interesting question. I think it's been said, and I said it, that we believe that decision makers are, especially policymakers, they are humans. So what storytelling does is, like we say, a story about one person, one death is a tragedy for policymakers. But if you take 1 million deaths, that becomes a statistics. So that's very helpful. When you are telling stories, you can connect easily to the human face of it, the emotional part of it. So it's very important for decision makers because they feel that, oh, okay, wow, that's very close to home. It's not just a percentage, it's not just a number, it's not just a figure. This is really something shocking because you can put a face, you can put a name, you can quickly relate to it, so you can build trust and rapport around it. So, and I think Prof said it also that, of course, you always want to balance. You want to balance that you are not, you are telling the story, but at the same time, you have facts. You are not diluting, you are not getting. So I think that's where the skill set is. But definitely storytelling speaks to decision makers, to policy makers, because they can easily relate to it, because it creates that emotional bond and that push for acting. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, Mamadou. Rose, we have Sharon, Rose, and Oladele who've raised their hands. Disego Ochao, perhaps you can unmute Rose, that we hear from her.
Thank you very much, panelists, for those nice presentations. Really exciting to know that there's a lot of great nexus between science, evidence, and policy. I just wanted to know about something. I think I want to stand on the podium of a scientist or a researcher, and I think I'm experiencing fatigue because science is a whole hog of logistics, a whole hog of expertise that is on my head. And I'm seeing that science communication, as it were, is now coming onto my plate again. Also know that science communication is really a field of its own, following a course of its own, theories of its own, and of course, they know how to do their business. I also know how to do the science. So when you look at this, and I also want to tie it with many other experts that we always engage in science. We've just talked about advocacy and lobbying. We've talked about science communication, and again, there is the monitoring and evaluation. Normally, we in research, and even financial management. In research, we always say that whenever you get a deficit in the skill that you don't have, you can almost engage. So I would just think that it's good to engage somebody who is more oriented to science journalism rather than really imposing yourself. So I'm feeling like there's some imposter syndrome that we actually are suffering from, because we are getting into a space that we really do not have expertise on. And then the other thing, I think, with science and politics, I know when politics stands best, we are going to influence policies. And we are trying to put our best foot forward to talk to politicians. And that is why we are talking about key high-level kind of speeches, just 1 minute speech, so that because we want to think that they don't have time. I have a problem with this because in many parts of the world that we have visited, we don't even wait for dissemination. We don't even wait to bring policy makers. I have seen policy makers going to science and actually looking for evidence on tweaking their policies, evidence on making their practice work. But here we are the ones who are trying to lure ourselves into their business. And I find it really lopsided, because it's like we are intruding so much, and that is why we are fatigued. So what is your comment on this? Seeing imposter syndrome, fatigue on researchers, and the fact that politicians think that we should be the ones to reach out and not them, which I think is rolling out, and we are feeling that we are not wanted in the business of policy. That is all.
Thank you, Rose. A lot to unpack there. I don't know who among my very able speakers would like to provide some insights to that. Deborah, are you with us in the room?
Thank you, Anne. I hope you can see me, even if I'm a bit clear. Thanks, Rose, for that question. I think you're talking about encroaching into other people's business. I think I like what Des, or is it Dixon, said, and Alex might have also emphasized that you can look at it in two ways. Number one, yes, should researchers be doing any policy engagement, any advocacy, any science communication? The answer is yes and no. And yes, in that we're living in a space where currently a lot of funders right now, if you look at a lot of the funding calls, and there's a lot of competition where they're saying, what is the impact of your work? So it's not just the research, but actually, how are you going to make sure that there's going to be some impact in the work that you're doing? And therefore, you can't talk about impact without talking about how do you get the research from the lab to policies? How do you get the research to the communities that need it? How do you get the research to the products? And so you really need to be playing in this space. And you can either think of it this way, whether you are building your own skills to be able to do that, or engaging other people to do that. So the specialists, the com specialists, the advocacy specialists, the policy engagement specialists, and certainly in most African institutions, you'll find that they will either have one person to do that sort of work, or none at all, and that person is usually gets to do is doing 100 roles in one: community engagement, policy engagement, advocacy, communications, multimedia, digital content, and so really they cannot be effective when they are expected to be 10 people in one. So I think the mindset really needs to shift, because we're in a landscape where we can't afford to not be to do that anymore. If we cannot do it ourselves, then maybe let's think about engaging people who can actually do the work. Thank you.
And you didn't introduce yourself. Deborah is a communications manager at APHRC. Thank you for those insights. Rose, I hope that was satisfactory. We actually have ran past time, but I'll allow one question from Oladele. We will be able to collate these questions together and have our speakers respond to them and share as we share the webinar resources. So if your question is not answered during this session, don't worry, you will get a response soon. Chao or Pisego, you can unmute Oladele, and please, Oladele, take less than a minute. Okay, maybe it's not there with us. Okay.
Hello? Have I been unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much for this. Thank you very much for this. I'm a professor of public health, and I've been in that business for more than 25 years. I must commend APHRC for this, for putting together these eminent people to address this nagging problem, which I've been facing. I think all of Africa has been facing it. Now, researchers are produced by institutions, just like we produce legal practitioners, medical practitioners, and so on. The institutions have a responsibility. What responsibility should the institution have in changing curriculum and the way we produce the researchers? and moving away from things like SPSS, modeling and all that kind of thing, and adding advocacy and research for policy into their curriculum. That's my question. Thanks a lot, APHRC, for this.
Thanks, Oladele. When you mentioned advocacy, straight I went to Alex. Alex.
Yeah, that's an important comment, and I will add to his question by saying that, for example, even the way institutions are structured in terms of the career progression, it's about, for example, one of the biggest parameters they use is publications. For you to become a professor, for you to lead a learning institution, for example, even in places like my apologies, even in places like that organization, for example, you'll find that the career progression is also pegged on publications and how many papers that you have churned out there. So the curriculum is a sure thing that needs to be relooked at if we were to change the way we do things. But beyond that, also, I think, Oladele, it's important that even the incentive program is relooked at in terms of career progression and who gets to the top. Because if you don't change those two things, for sure, the researchers will not find a reason why they should venture into things that do not add value to their career progression. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So we are past time, and this goes to show that this is quite an important conversation, an interesting one, and we can go on and on, but it's also good to respect scheduled time, and we've already stolen your 7 minutes, so allow me to steal 3 more. And as I bring the session to a close, I would like to just pick a few nuggets that I have had go around from the participants in the chat, from the speakers. There's a lot of conversation about research impact. What does it constitute when we say research has been impactful? Is it when we have 2,000 publications, when we have further funding, etc., and all these are great outputs. But I believe it's not when we publish, it's not when we get additional funding, it's not when we present our findings, and all these are important. It actually begins when researchers choose to engage with the society, because you're doing research that in one way or another, directly or indirectly affects the people. So if this research and the evidence generated cannot actually come back and change their lives, then really we cannot say that impact has been achieved. This engagement, we've seen that it is long-term. Des said there are no quick wins. You have to invest, you have to put yourself out there, you have to understand your audience, you have to build relationships, you have to understand the context, and you have to appreciate and be patient that the process might take a while. It's long-term, and you have to sort of go on putting these different ingredients until you get to the end result of research actually being impactful. And so I would like to stop this session, but not the conversation. We will be engaging with you post this session. One, to be able to sort of share some of the discussions that have come out, some of the themes that we've gathered. As my colleagues have mentioned, it's a webinar series and also a series of other combined initiatives that sort of bring out the wholesome strengthening in terms of knowledge translation and uptake. So I'm quite confident that our engagement will not end once our webinar manager hits the end webinar button, but we'll continue to do this. Just to remind you that our survey is still open. We would want to hear from you. And in case you had looked at the questions and you are not sure how to respond, I'm sure after these discussions, you sort of know now the next conversation. Excuse me, the next conversations, what would you like us to feature? My colleague has shared that in the chat. Please take 3 to 4 minutes to respond to this. And to really thank you, the participants. If you did not come, we would not have had such a vibrant conversation. the speakers, Dixon, Alex, and Des. It's been wonderful to hear your insights. Enjoyed being a student, and we cannot thank you enough for just taking the time to, come share your wisdom and expertise with us. Thank you very much. And to the team behind the webinar organization, Mama Ponya, Lesego Chow, Deborah, thank you as well for making it such a success. And yeah, I wish you a lovely evening. Please expect some post-webinar communication from us, and we hope to see you in our next engagements and sessions. Please look out for the communication for this. Thank you so much, and enjoy your evening.